Doctors like us have demanding schedules, so growing our portfolios shouldn't be another burden. And the last thing we want when we take off our scrubs is a call from a tenant about an overflowing toilet. So Equity Multiple brings us streamlined access to vetted real estate investments that work for us, even when we're off the clock. And only 5% make the cut. Once we invest, a team of professionals goes to work to maximize our returns. With a minimum investment of just $5,000, diversify outside the stock market with cash flowing CRE like multifamily, industrial self-storage, and more. Welcome to modern real estate investing. Visit equitymultiple.com to learn more. That's equitymultiple.com. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. And today we have a super special guest. We have Dr. John Lundell, who's an anesthesiologist, and we're going to be talking about how to minimize our use of jargon when we're with our patients. And he does this expertly and teaches people how to do it as an expert witness, and also does it with his patients. So let me just first introduce you to Dr. Lundell. Skipping forward in his life a little bit, 2005, he, along with his wife and two children, settled in the Dallas area, where he was with a private practice anesthesia group at Baylor. He offered his booklet as a teaching tool for students there that he had previously created, and revising it several times over the intervening years. And some of you might recognize the title because I did. I had it when I had done an anesthesia rotation as an intern. It's Anesthesia Myths, not Mrs. Myths. After students and nurses and techs expressed their enthusiasm for the book, he published a version geared towards perioperative nurses as well. And then the 2021 edition was written specifically for medical students and resident rotators. He's currently updating the book for an early 2025 edition, so coming out soon. Check it out. But backtracking a little bit about his life, in 2018, he added expert witness pursuits, and that's why he's on the show today, on top of having written a book geared towards non-physicians. So he's consulted for both plaintiff and defense cases in more than 20 states, and he coaches and mentors physicians who are learning to be expert witnesses. And Dr. Lundell, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Brad.
So before we get into this, how we can get better at using less jargon, because patients complain about this. We see people posting it on social media and writing articles about how doctors talk, and we always talk medical speak and people can't understand us. I just want to give our colleagues some credit here, because when we talk to another physician, when we find out that a patient is a physician, it's almost like our shoulders relax and we can take a deep breath and relax and speak plainly, which to lay people isn't plainly, but to us, it's plainly. Like, we don't have to put as much effort into translating from medical speak into lay speak. We can just speak as we think about our problems. So that tells me that we do actually put significant effort into explaining things in such a way for patients. But the reason you're here is so we can get even better at it.
You know, that example I think is true to the extent that when we're talking with other physicians, say they come in as a patient and we're talking to them, we feel like we don't have to skip the jargon altogether. But sometimes that's a trap, because a lot of times other physicians are a little bit nervous about admitting that they don't know everything, and they can still get stuck on jargon that is not in their own specialty, and they don't really quite know what it means. So it's best to gauge your audience, find out, ask them, hey, did this make sense? Do you have any questions? In fact, a better way to phrase it is, what questions or concerns do you have that I can help you with? So it's not, oh, yes or no. It's they get to think about it a little bit and get to come up with a good question for you.
I like that phrasing, gives them permission to ask a question. Like, what questions do you have? The assumption being that there are some, and if there aren't, then they can clearly say that they don't have it. But as opposed to the bit of a disingenuous, do you have any questions with your hand on the door, would be the opposite of that.
Yeah. And we've all had the attending or the teacher of some sort who made that query to us. Do you have any questions? And you can tell by their tone that they really don't want to answer any questions, and you better not ask one. Or if you do, it should be a good one. That's what we're used to, at least in our generation. Some of the younger generation, maybe they get a little bit of kinder and gentler attendings. I don't know. That's the rumor anyway.
I certainly hope so. But I remember being a medical student. We're digressing a little. That's okay. Being a medical student and being told if you don't ask a question, it tells them that you're not interested. So you have to think of a question. So now you're like racking your brain to try and think of something. Meanwhile, they're ready to go, but you're not reading the room because you're just nervous and trying to get a good grade. And so you coach other physicians about how to be an expert witness, right? And one of the
Right.
things that you coach physicians about is how to speak to a jury so that they understand you, and the lawyers as well. The lawyers, if they're in a particular space for long enough, they get to know some of the jargon, but really we do still need to, our job in that capacity is the explainer. And so the idea behind this episode is that since you train other physicians to do that and be good at explaining things to juries, we can take that skill and put it in the exam room. So let's just start with, how does jargon creep its way into our speech? Because it definitely happens without us even realizing.
Oh, yeah. We're so used to it in presenting cases on rounds or in conferences. And most of us are pretty busy. We're overbooked and sometimes running late. And anything that we can do that kind of speeds the whole process up. I mean, you talk about with the hand on the door going out, we are taught to abbreviate a lot of our writing and our speaking into as concise presentation as possible, but just the facts. And if we skip a little bit of the emotion that comes with the patients, especially if they're here for something really serious, like patients are often really scared when they're seeing me because they're going under, maybe they don't know if they have cancer or they do, and they don't know how bad it is. So they've got a lot on their mind and they aren't always focused on asking good questions or really doing more than having that glassy stare and nodding their head. We need to find out, do they really understand? And so, yeah, we have to read the room, as you said, and ask the questions, find out what questions do they have. And in fact, when I'm talking with patients, I ask them that several times. I ask them, what questions do you have? And as I think I've wrapped up, I try it again and maybe again to make sure that they know what they're getting into and that they've understood what I've explained. Honestly, as part of informed consent, which is maybe one of the issues we'll talk about a little bit later, but that it's really important to make sure that it hasn't just gone in one ear and out the other and left them with okay, doc kind of attitude.
So when you have a one-to-one conversation with a patient, you're able to prompt them. You can read their body language. You can try and figure out if they're understanding. You can give them all these permissions to ask to find out we should be doing that. We should be checking and checking to make sure that they understand what we're saying. On the expert witness side, right, you can't do that. And so how do you do that with a jury with whom you can't, there's no dialogue. It's all monologue.
No, and in fact, with a jury and half the time with an antagonistic lawyer asking you the questions, not just throwing lob balls for you to hit over the fence, you're forced to look at their body language as you can. You want to focus on the jury. The lawyer is pulling your attention their direction, and you want to see, are they sitting forwards in their seats? Are they opening their eyes, nodding their head? Making sense, or are they looking off into space and maybe fiddling with their thumbs or falling asleep? If they're doing that, it may be time to ask for a break if it's been going on for a while, or recalibrate a little bit in your head. Maybe I'm droning on too long. Maybe I haven't figured out a way to present it in terms that are everyday language to them.
Okay. So it's all reliant on nonverbal cues.
Absolutely.
Okay. So where do we start if we're trying to work on becoming more aware of our speech? Because we already said these are the ways that you can read the audience, but monitoring our own speech, recognizing when we are drifting into language that might be too sophisticated. And it might not even be medical jargon per se, but rather if this person speaks at an 8th grade reading level, you might not be able to use a lot of the vocabulary that isn't necessarily technical. And so how do we start to recognize when we're drifting?
I think it starts, as do most things of great importance in life, in the home. You probably chat with your spouse, your significant other, maybe your kids. There's probably people in your life that you talk to a little bit about what you do that are not educated in your specialty or in medicine at all. And it's good to find out if you find yourself talking about stuff and they don't understand, either they tell you or they give you the glassy-eyed stare, that kind of is something you're starting to alert yourself to by paying attention to those things. And if you're trying to, for example, write an expert report, hey, if 8th grade reading level is what they need, it's wonderful if you can find an 8th grader to read it to. or some reasonable facsimile. There may be somebody that you know that is smart, but not educated either to their full completion of their education or not educated in the medical field at all. And find out, test it on them and ask them afterwards. If it's something you're preparing for an audience that is non-medical, ask them for feedback and say, hey, did that make sense? And maybe ask them, could you tell me what you understand about this or that or the other particular jargon or subject that you were trying to explain?
So finding opportunities to practice, just like anything else.
Absolutely.
You get better at it by practice. Okay. But with a specific eye to what you're trying to get better at. It's funny, you said talk to your spouse. A couple of months ago, I was talking to my wife about something that involved a fistula. Now, I don't remember if it was like an ENT thing. You can get an oral antral fistula where the mouth and the maxillary sinus communicate through a hole where a tooth used to be, or it was a rectovaginal fistula. I was talking about something clearly unrelated to my field, but we were talking about fistula. And I said, they're communicating. And that word, even though it's a word in her vocabulary, she didn't understand that I was using it in the same manner. She was like, wait, those two things are talking to each other? It doesn't make any sense. I was like, oh, so even this like everyday language that we use in a different way, you got to make sure that you're not doing that. And so you're right.
I think
It
she spoke
became
up,
apparent
right?
to me. And I had never realized it before, that communication is something that I have to use to make sure I'm explaining well.
Yeah. I'm married to a radiologist, and she sometimes hears my end of the conversation when I'll call my patients the night before anesthesia. Sometimes they pick up the phone, sometimes they don't. But if they do, I ask them what questions you might have that I can help you with. And if they want to call me back, then we have a conversation and find out what they're worried about. Sometimes they really don't have a question, but they have something they want to tell me that, my goodness, it'll make them sleep so much better at night if they know that I know that in advance of their surgery. This opportunity to communicate, sometimes my wife hears my side of the conversation and later will tell me, hey, I'm not sure if they understood some of those words you were using. And so I get some feedback from her. And I also on occasion get to, because she has the luxury of reading from home. She does mammography mostly. So she has to make phone calls to patients and tell them they have breast cancer or they might have breast cancer. They need a biopsy. And sometimes when the word cancer comes out of your mouth, all thought leaves your patient's brain and they can't process anything after that. So you have to be careful about the timing or the way in which you say stuff. Now, she can't always save it for the very end of the conversation, like I will sometimes do with the scary stuff about anesthesia. But when she does it, she can tell people, hey, I'm a breast cancer survivor. We've caught this early. We don't even know if it's breast cancer until we get the results of the biopsy. She has kind of a set number of things that she tells people to try and help communicate this really difficult thing that they don't want to hear, but they need to hear. And that helps them. First, they can feel that she cares. And I think that makes a big difference in communication. And then the fact that she has done it enough times before that she has a routine of what words work helps her get through it as well.
But she's at a disadvantage because there are a lot of nonverbal cues that she might not be able to get because she's doing that over the phone. Like that's even harder.
That is very true.
For all the listeners, just to plug the podcast, there's an old episode I did a long time ago with Anthony Orsini, who's a neonatologist, and we talk about breaking bad news. So if you want to get a deeper dive on breaking bad news, check out that episode with Anthony Orsini. Sorry, you were saying, Dr. Lundell.
No, that's a great commentary and a difficult subject, I think. But yeah, one thing that my wife does get, she gets sometimes feedback from the mammography technicians who tell her, oh, you're the best at explaining stuff. We really like it when you're the one who gets it. So it's nice for her to hear that. I get to brag a little bit about my wife, but it's good for the patients. It really is. When you care, especially if you don't have a lot of time, because many physicians are really rushed for time. But if you can convey that you care and you ask the questions, they're usually willing to trust you with maybe feeling a little bit stupid, saying, hey, this might be a dumb question, but I want to know this. And they feel safer in your care.
Yeah. And I think I'm glad your wife is doing well. You know, the fact that she is a breast cancer survivor as well. She's able to say to them, listen, I've been through something similar to you. I'm doing fine. And I'm sure that little bit of information puts them at ease. This person recognizes what I'm thinking and going through right now. So they get me. And I'm sure that helps them communicate, frees the lines of communication a little more.
Yeah.
So let's talk about informed consent because it's complicated. And if you are changing the language, because some of these things that we're getting informed consent about, right? Like I take out tonsils There's a couple risks involved. It's easy to understand. You can see the tonsils. Like, it's not that complicated. But like a cochlear implant, right? There's a lot to this. And if you're changing the language to fit their comprehension, how do you strike that balance between communicating accurately something that's pretty complicated, but still explaining it simply, right? Complex versus simply. These are two opposing ideas.
Yeah, that can be really tricky. Not only because of the emotions involved if they're going through a difficult diagnosis or just undergoing a procedure and feeling scared about it, but also trying to understand the intricacies. I think it's really important to think through what you're talking about. And you probably have a chance to explain to a few different levels of education and understanding. So you probably know which parts are the hardest to understand. And honestly, it really is, it's translation work, not just from English to Spanish or something like that, it might be, but from doctorese, medicalese into plain English. And so I think sometimes we're at risk for oversimplifying, but it might be better to first oversimplify and then add a couple layers more of understanding on it, build their knowledge base over a short period of time to get them to be able to understand what the issues are and why you're talking about them, unloading with both barrels. Here, this is what you need to know, and trusting that they get it.
So build a foundation of knowledge, check on that foundation of knowledge for validity. Not sure that's the right word. You know what I mean? And then on that base of knowledge, then you can talk about the risks. So don't just go into the risks, but rather set the foundation first.
Yes.
So when we had communicated previously, you had talked about using examples as a great way to explain complex health information. So can you give us an example of one of the examples?
Yes, I have used this example. I think it's original to me, but I've used this example in both my book in talking about muscle relaxants and also in some of my expert witness work talking about narcotic reversal. But it's the idea of competitive inhibition. It's receptors, it's neurotransmitters, it's different amounts. And what I tell people is, okay, a receptor is like a chair or a parking spot in the brain where a drug can sit or a blocker can sit. So it can either send a signal down the way or block signals from going through. And it's a little bit like a game of musical chairs played in teams. So you have team Narcan and team fentanyl, if we're talking about opioid receptors. And there's 7 chairs out there of opioid receptors just waiting for a chemical to sit down in them. And as the music's playing, there's 5 units of fentanyl in there. And when the music stops, you're probably going to get about equal numbers, 3 or 4 of each of Narcan and fentanyl. But if you decide you're going to give a big dose of Narcan, and all of a sudden you have 50 molecules of Narcan playing the game, and you still only have the 5 molecules of fentanyl, guess what? There's probably not going to be any fentanyl sitting in the receptors, and therefore no pain relief. That can be a problem depending on what the situation is. If it's an overdose, hey, that's what you're going for. But if the patient's just had surgery, you really might not want to take all their pain relief. And then the other example, of course, is with muscle relaxation, which I deal with every day, trying to reverse that. Before I wake patients up and take their breathing tube out, I want to make sure they're going to be strong enough. It's team acetylcholine and team rocuronium that are battling for the chairs and the neuromuscular junction blocking game of musical chairs.
I love that. I love the visual because that people can really understand that. And because we do the same few things, or a lot of us do the same few things over and over, you can develop that. It's like a shtick over time, right? You start at one point in your career, you were like, let me try a musical chairs analogy and see if that works. Then you're like, hey, that seemed to really work. And then you play with it a little bit until you get it just right. I sometimes will try analogies that I haven't used before, and I'll have to just admit, wow, that really just didn't work. That just felt, I'm sorry, that made no sense. My fault. Let me try something else. But yeah, iterate. I talk about it when I talk about being funny, using humor in the exam room, using humor with your patients. Just try stuff. Don't be offensive. Try to make your patients laugh. It's fine. They'll even appreciate the effort. So same with this. If it doesn't work, you know what? It's fine. Try something else because you'll find something that works.
Yeah, I agree with both humor and with analogies.
So what have you seen? What are some traps that physicians tend to fall in or pitfalls with where we do tend to fall into jargon, either that you've seen when you coach physicians as expert witnesses or observed of your colleagues, when you're explaining anesthesia to people, there's usually an anesthesiologist next door and an anesthesiologist on the other side, especially at the beginning of the day. So you do observe your colleagues. Without throwing anyone under the bus, what are some of the pitfalls that we tend to fall in?
Certainly, if we're pressed for time, we sometimes aren't watching for the clues. We sometimes don't wait and ask to make sure that they've understood us. Sometimes, if we assume a little bit too much knowledge on their part, like I said, if they're a physician or if there's somebody else who's pretty highly educated, we may say, oh, some jargon's okay here. They probably should understand this. And we may be jumping to conclusions that aren't warranted. But the other big risk is finding yourself going too much the other way. Nobody likes to be told about something as if they're a toddler. And you can feel it. You can hear it in their tone. And it may be unconscious, or it may just be the person is a little bit of a jerk and that they condescend to everybody. And I think we all know some physicians like that. But if you talk down to the patients, they can feel that and they don't like it. They can understand, but it's not good, effective communication. Striking a balance of finding the right words. And like you said, a lot of times we're saying the same thing. So we can practice and hone it a little bit and know what it is that we need to say. And oftentimes, we can even predict the questions the patients are going to ask. And they're usually incorporated into our shtick. We just haven't gotten down to that part of it yet and say, yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. And then when we finish, if we've done a good job, the patients usually say something. They usually say, wow, I thank you. That's a very thorough explanation, or I appreciate, I really understand, I feel safe, or whatever it is. Usually you get some feedback, and that's a really good feeling to be able to say, okay, that's working and I'm going to keep doing that.
It is. It's the best when they feel like you've taken excellent care of them. I've even had that happen where the outcome wasn't necessarily ideal, but they're still really grateful for the care. It's just so nice because you really made a connection there.
Yeah, that's true. I think the better that they feel like you're paying attention to them and communicating with them, and the more they trust you, even if there's a problem and things don't come out perfectly, you're much more likely to have a favorable result medical legally than if you're just cold and just the facts and let's get this done. I got to get to my next patient or whatever it is.
And it's just more satisfying. It's more satisfying having those relationships. Like that Harvard study that talked about the greatest predictor of health and longevity is the strength of your social connections. These are professional connections, but there's something social about them too. And I think it's just a more enjoyable job when you can make connections like that. There's so much less friction.
In fact, on some of those days when I just feel like, oh boy, here I am, another day at work, and what I do to try and help me get out of that feeling is just remind myself, I've got these people here and I like interacting with people. And it buoys me up. It helps me fight okay, this is just another case.
The mundane, because we've seen it, every problem that we've seen so many times before, but it's the personal connections that really help it along. So are there any tools or resources that you found helpful? Because I just want to mention one, which is ChatGPT. And like we talked about it on an episode a while ago with Dr. Castro, calls himself Dr. GPT, because he uses it to create instructions that are at the reading level of the patient. Because you can take instructions that you've pre-written, feed it through ChatGPT, and ask it to rewrite it at a certain grade level, and it will do it for you. So I think that's a great resource that we definitely need to look into. But for yourself, are there any other resources that you have found helpful for minimizing the complex medical language and jargon that you use?
First, let me react to that ChatGPT thing, because I'm going to reveal my generational gap here. I have not been a user of AI much at all. And it's nice to know that there's some really good applications out there. I've got to inform myself and learn how does this darn thing work, honey? But as far as resources go, I think colleagues, if you're trying to do the expert witness thing, then practicing so you don't feel nervous, because nerves can get you to fall back into habits of medical jargon, and it can feel like it's a layer of protection that you're using your medical language and your knowledge to help protect you from your anxiety or from whatever.
Yeah.
But so colleagues are somebody that's really useful to go to help practice. But like I said, family, friends, the neighborhood 8th grader, just
make sure you know them. Don't just pick up a random 8th grader. That is not okay.
Yeah, get permission from their parents first too, so you don't get called on as a criminal. But yeah, I think those kind of opportunities to find out, and maybe you give a talk somewhere to your church group or to a local community organization. I spent last Saturday talking to a group of Parkinson's patients about anesthesia and Parkinson's and some of the different medications. A lot of the medications for Parkinson's deal with receptors, and the dopamine receptors are what all the Parkinson's medicines are all about. And anti-dopamine receptor or medications are what a lot of the anti-nausea medicine is about. So it's a little bit tricky. When I was done, they were really appreciative because I shared some personal stories and some things like that. And that helped communicate, I think, in a more effective and a more personal way that they can remember better.
Fantastic. So if people want to turn to you for expert witness coaching, or they just want to find you online, where can we find you?
I've got a website, drjohnlundell.com, drjohnlundell.com. And it has also my email, drjohnlundell@gmail.com. And just send me an email or call me up. I think my phone number's on the website as well, my cell phone. If you want some practice, you want to learn about expert witnessing. I'm also writing a book about expert witnessing, hopefully getting that all finished up in 2025 as well.
You've got 2 books coming out in 2025.
Yeah. Sometimes maybe I've bitten off a little more than I can chew, but it's a fun activity. It's rewarding. I've got a couple of friends that kind of started up expert witnessing and colleagues that knew I was doing it and asked me about it. And I've coached them along a little bit and mentored them and said, hey, here's what you can do. Here's some of the stuff I've written that may be able to help you out. Or if you want to show me a report or you want to bounce a case off me or an idea and kind of get an opinion, let's chat. That's something that I enjoy.
And clearly open to it, because I cold called you and you responded, and here we are. Thank you so much for taking the time to educate us on how to minimize our use of complex language and jargon, because certainly we get raked over the coals for it. And so we could all do it a bit better. And thank you for your time.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other, even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice or financial advice or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.